Heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fill us all things. Joys our blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity. Save our souls, O good one. So tonight is a little slightly unstructured. I've got some, ideas I want to get across, but it seemed like people had a lot of questions about the liturgy, and what I was thinking is maybe we could have a kind of a discussion about those questions, which would help me to figure out where to go with putting the course together. I spent a lot of the day actually immersed in some of the literature, the Old Testament foundations of the liturgy, and it was absolutely fascinating. But I'm thinking that it's kind of heavy duty theology, and although it is a perfect sequel to the Book of Hebrews, because ultimately the Book of Hebrews is about the liturgy and what the liturgy manifests, and it's still heavy-duty theology, and maybe it might be better in context when we're going into the. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I was also thinking I would look at the context of the liturgy, where it fits in into the contemporary life of the church as we practice it, as it exists in the Typicon. How the church structures the services, the services of the day, of the week, of the month, all of that kind of thing, and where the liturgy fits, and then a little bit of history of the liturgy before we get into an actual analysis of the text. Does that sound good? Okay. First off, what kind of questions do you all have? What?
Are there any, maybe my question is not even the right kind of question, but are there essential parts of the liturgy? Are there, the purpose is the consecration?
Okay, yeah, that's...
But is there, because there are some that the Reformers, well, the Protestants, and then others have argued, it's not so much about what they say, but that you could remove certain aspects. And I don't know if you're in the field, if there's a war and you're in a camp, or you're...
Oh, yeah,
So
that's actually
situations where you can't have a building and you can't have certain things.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a very classical question. The basic outline of the answer is that on one hand, as Orthodox, we tend not to think of individual moments as being more or less sacred. I mean, there are certain things where the Eucharistic liturgy is not the Eucharist unless you have certain elements that are there. And there are certainly some things that can be omitted especially if there's an emergency, kind of like if you were in a field chapel in a war zone or something like that. I think probably the most important thing is that we look at the liturgy as a process, and it's a process, it's a journey, it's a movement. And the whole thing is a movement. Now there are several movements within the liturgy. There are two ascents within the liturgy. The first is the ascent to communion with the Word of God in the reading of the Gospel. and the sermon, which should follow immediately after the reading of the gospel, which brings you to the point where you can then ascend onto the higher level to communion in Christ, with Christ by receiving his body and blood. Sacramental communion. Both are sacraments. Hearing the word, the reading of the scriptures is actually sacramental. You know, in fact, that's kind of the only sacrament that the Protestants have left, really. You know, it's the means by which they come into some kind of, you know, into communion with God, more than anything else. And that's it. Whereas for us, I mean, we've got multiple means of actualizing communion with God. So in the Eucharist, in the Eucharistic celebration, you've got the two basic parts of the liturgy. Then there's the preparation as well. It's the preparation with the proscomedia. Then there's the liturgy of the word, which is everything from the very beginning, the antiphons, and then the trisagion. And if you look at, you know, especially in the old traditional churches, where behind the altar there was a set of stairs going up to a high throne, and the whole thing is literally an ascent. And so there was the entrance into the church. You know, we still have that "Come, let us worship," right? When the bishop, you know, think about a hierarchical liturgy, which is kind of the standard of the liturgy. Everybody gathers. There's some psalms that are sung, but then, you know, "Come, let us worship," and there's the bishop blesses in the four directions with the candles, and then goes up the stairs to the ambo, just in front of the royal doors, blesses again with the candles, hands off one of the tricuri, it keeps the decuri, and it has the censer, and he censes the altar and everybody and the people, and the choir sings the Spolaiti Despota and all that. And
why is he keeping the decuri and not the tricuri? Does it make sense? I don't know.
It does, because he then later takes the tricuri and blesses.
Okay, so and then he has both.
And yeah, well, he starts off with both, hands off the one, then hands off the decuri and takes the tricuri, then hands that off. But that's in, so, you know, then there's the singing of the trisagion, and then they go and the bishop sits in the throne on the high place. In the ancient Syriac churches, ancient Byzantine churches, it was literally a high place. In some of the Syrian churches, it was like 20 steps up. So it was way up there in the apse. Now, that made for fantastic acoustics. And the churches were designed for the acoustics so that you didn't have to have any sound amplification, because there wasn't any.
Right.
You know, so you had these marble echo chambers, you know, with domes, you know, and that even enhances the acoustic. And then you have the apse in the back of the altar, you know, which is, you know.
So you didn't need those deacons that were screaming almost. You know?
Actually, you know, it was one of the most fascinating liturgies I ever served was in near Tbilisi, Georgia, with the patriarch in a church called Svetitska Veli, which is the place on the pillar where the robe of the Lord is buried. There was a pillar that was erected on top of it. And so the church is 1,000 years old. There were 7,000 people in the church. There were 3,000 people outside the church who couldn't get in. And a choir of 8 men filled the entire space.
Wow.
Now, they know how to sing. They really know how to sing. But 8 men and no microphones, no nothing. You know, and the church is very high. there's probably 10 stories space.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing, and it's been there 1,000 years. So, our acoustic engineers don't know how to design churches like that.
So when the Pope went, right, Vladimir, on his visit to Georgia?
I think he probably was.
Father Seraphim was one of the singers.
Yeah. But so anyway, so you have this ascent, and then the bishop is up there, and then there's the epistle and the gospel. And it used to be that the bishop would either preach from the throne, because in the ancient way of doing things, the teacher would sit, and everybody else would stand. Whereas for Americans, the teacher stands and everybody else sits. So there was also a structure called the ambo, which was an elevated platform in the center of the church, with stairs going up each direction and rails, and the preacher, the deacon would stand on that to do the litanies, and the preacher, the gospel would be read from there, and the preacher would preach from there.
Does that model the idea of our little thing in the middle?
Yeah, that's like a tiny micro remnant of that.
But does it model that idea? Or?
It's the idea. Yeah.
Okay.
Because in Hagia Sophia you had it was this massive structure. It had an archway underneath, and on either side were the choirs of 200 people each. And who could easily pass through underneath the platform. And this was, it was a massive cathedral. So anyway, so you had this first ascent, with the which was manifesting the ascent of the bishop to the high place, and then and the reading of the gospel and the communion with Christ in the hearing of the gospel and the preaching, and then the secondary ascent, or the second ascent. So the liturgy of the word, and then the liturgy of the Eucharist. And so the catechumens were kicked out, the doors were locked, and the liturgical bouncers were put at the doors, called doorkeepers, and they were specifically ordained for that. And I'm sure they had some kind of beefy guys who were,
Wow.
So then the liturgy of the Eucharist, as we pretty much as we know it would happen. And what is that? It's the ultimate liturgical ascent into the kingdom, to receive, to be fed by Christ. Now, but this whole thing is a process of ascent. It's a journey. Now, one of the big issues historically, because you asked about moments of indispensable or not, is in the nature of the consecration. And in Latin theology, in the Western liturgy, they have the epiclesis, which is the calling down of the Holy Spirit on the bread and the wine, is very undeveloped. It historically is undeveloped in the Western liturgy. Whereas in the Eastern liturgies, it's central. And in the Eastern Church, that is almost more important than the words of institution. The Western Church, the words of institution, take heed, this is my body, take and drink, all of this is my blood. That was what was critical in the Western Church, and they considered that the gifts were consecrated by those words. But in the Eastern Church, it's this whole process of the prayers and the words of the institution, culminating in the calling down of the Holy Spirit upon the bread and the wine, that it might become the body and blood of Christ. And so that in the Eastern churches, not just the Greek Orthodox tradition, which we are, but in the Oriental Orthodox tradition, in the Nestorian so-called tradition, Church of the East tradition, it's the same as with us.
Do you have consecrations outside of the liturgy?
Of the Eucharist? No. No. So, you know, there's the old thing. What happens if if a bread truck goes by and the priest says, "Take, eat, this is my body," and all of a sudden you've got a whole bread truck full of, well, obviously that's not, you know. And of course, and in the Orthodox Church, of course, nobody would recognize. They wouldn't even think that that's funny because it's just strange. But in the West, you know, they would play with ideas like that. Even, you know, is it possible to have the consecration of the gifts outside of the liturgy? And we would say no. Or it doesn't, or it would be something absolutely extraordinary. Now, can the liturgy be abbreviated? Yes. You know, the antiphons are a late addition. So that's not an excuse to show up late. But the antiphons were actually the processional hymns that were used because all liturgies at one time were procession. Started with a procession at the bishop's house. And they would go in procession, they would sing the psalms with an antiphonal verse. You know, so like you go to a Greek church or even in our usage on the feasts, we have, you know, a psalm verse is sung, and then there's an antiphon that's so. So, for example, the first one is "Through the prayers of the Theotokos, Savior, save us," right? And in the Greek church now they've cut out the psalm verses and just use the, you know, they sing the antiphon verse 3 times or even just once sometimes, and all of that gets truncated. But that's what it was. It was a procession to the church, and that's why, for example, you have the Beatitudes with these long verses. Well, it was to kill time, especially if it was a long way to the church, you know, and so the bishop's house was more or less would be in the center of the city, and most often he would probably go to the cathedral, but very often they would go to the outlying churches around the city, and of course they would walk. So, in procession. So anyway, so the small entrance, and as they walked to church, they would carry stuff with them. Now, you look at icon of a bishop. He's usually got a gospel book, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's because in the early days, the bishop would carry the gospel book with him. He might hand it over to a deacon if it got heavy, but, you know, for a while, but in the procession, but he would have the gospel book with him. That was one of the marks of his office. And so what is the rite for this entrance into the church? It's essentially it's the blessing with the gospel book, right? So you finish the antiphon, and there's a prayer, and we'll go into all of that, and then the deacon holds up the gospel book. Wisdom makes a cross with it. Wisdom let us attend. That was actually the entrance into the church originally, and then they would sing the Troparion and the Kontakion, you know, the theme hymns for the day, and go into the Trisagion and the readings. So, 5 minutes. 10 minutes maybe, instead of half an hour like we have now. Then it used to be that the prayers of the liturgy were all read aloud. In fact, there's an ancient canon called a nomocanon, which meant that it was both a civil and a canon law that specified that by law the prayers of the liturgy had to be read aloud, which especially in Rokor practice, nothing is read aloud virtually, whereas in the ancient church, it's kind of understandable as the church grew. So you have this little old frail bishop, right? And he couldn't sing loud enough so that anybody would hear all of that stuff, you know. So eventually it just came to the point where they would do the prayers quietly, and then there was all sorts of superstition creeping in that all the people weren't worthy to hear the prayers, and you know, or they were still pagans, and then which was partly true, you know, in reality. And so by the 6th, 7th century, the prayers had become silent, and that's been done for a long time. But the litanies were added to cover up the prayers. And when you're serving, especially as a bishop or as a priest even, it's really nice to have a deacon, because the deacon says the litanies and you can concentrate on saying the prayers. Whereas if you're the priest serving by yourself, you have to figure out when you can say the prayers so that it doesn't disrupt, and because one of the things that we don't do in Eastern liturgy is silence, right? Mm-hmm. In modern Catholic liturgy, especially, they'll have these long meditative periods, right? And sometimes
the Russian cannot be silent.
No, in the Orthodox Church, it's non-stop, you know, words, and so you have all sorts of repetition. So you've got the little litanies, and you have to do everything twice, right?
3 times.
At least.
You might do it twice, you might as well do it a third time.
You know, it's again and again. Again and again. Paki, paki, etiki, etiki. So you do the little litany twice, and you do the litany of... the litany of fervent supplication is basically just a repeat of the great litany, only you sing Lord have mercy 3 times instead of just once. Mm-hmm. Then you've got the little litanies before the catechumens is just done once, but then you've got the 2 little litanies before the entrance, and one of them is a repeat of the little litany, you know, the 3 petitions. Again and again, peace, let us pray to the Lord. Help us, save us, have mercy on us, and commemorating our most holy, or calling to remembrance. Let's use Rokor translation. But then, right after the entrance, there's this long litany of supplication, and it's the Grant it, O Lord litany, right? So there are a couple petitions at the beginning, which are unique. Let us complete our morning prayer unto the Lord, or let us complete our prayer unto the Lord. For the precious gifts now offered, let us pray to the Lord. And then it goes into something that's going to be repeated 15 minutes later, or 10 minutes later, depending on how fast the priest and the choir are. And repeated word for word, which works if you've got 2 languages going. You know, because you can do the 2 languages and not miss anything. Mm-hmm. Hey, good to see. but you know, but all of that was basically added in order to cover up the prayers. And the main litany, and there's a remnant of it. You know how in the Western Church, when they have a litany, it's right in the middle, a great litany. That is actually the place where in the Eastern Church, and when you have a deacon serving, remember right before the great entrance, you have the deacon repeats the great litany. That's its original place. So we've got all these historical leftovers in the litany. Now, in contemporary practice, it differs from tradition to tradition. In Rokor, we generally don't omit anything. You know, litany for departed is done on Saturdays or for liturgies for the departed, but it's actually forbidden to do on Sundays because Sunday is the day of the resurrection. But if you go to a Greek church, they'll cut out all 5 litanies between the Gospel and the Cherubic hymn. And they'll cut out one of and they'll chop the antiphons down to 5 minutes, not 5 minutes apiece, but 5 minutes total. And they'll leave out probably the litany before the Lord's Prayer, or most of it, so that you can, so that in some places you can have liturgy in 45 minutes. And so there are reasons why many people like Rokor.
Why do they cut out all the litanies, but yet still insist to do everything completely twice in 2 languages? I've noticed that.
Well, if they do it all twice in 2 languages, they're not cutting anything out. They're just doing it in one language or the other. But usually, what they'll do is they may alternate languages and still cut large parts out.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me why they would just, you know, really insist on the 2 languages but still cut out so much, you know.
Yeah.
I never understood the logic of that. Why not just do the whole thing once and, you know. I mean, like you said, there's parts that are basically identical.
Well, they are identical.
Yeah, they are identical. So they just flip those, but instead of cutting out other parts that may not be identical.
Well, I mean, they have their reasons.
Yeah, I guess.
But would it make sense to hear the priest's prayers instead of hearing those litany all the time?
Yes, it does.
Because do they do that in OCA? I mean, when you go to St. Nicholas, you can hear Father Valeri, but you hear and you don't hear at the same time.
Yeah.
And he is reading the prayers, and there is no choir, there is nothing else. You can just hear his voice.
Right.
That's enough, I would say.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. You have to, if you're gonna say the prayers aloud, and that practice was revived mainly by the OCA. In the Russian Church, the priests, including all the way up to the patriarch, will say the prayers aloud in the altar, but so that everybody in the altar can hear them.
But not around.
Yeah, but you have to do the microphone and the whole bit for the rest of the congregation. I'm serving in Stafford now, which is like OCA usage, so they're used to having the anaphora aloud. So
in Russia, they were called secret prayers that we were not allowed to hear.
right.
That's the way we were taught.
Well, actually, there are 2 words in. One is the prayers. One set of prayers is labeled secret, and the other is labeled mystical. And so there's all sorts of different usages. One of the strangest things I ever saw was in a Greek church in Southern California, where you had the entire congregation say all of the priest's prayers aloud together.
Really?
Wow.
Wow, why not?
It doesn't work.
It doesn't work?
It doesn't work. That's not appropriate, and in the first place. In the second place, it's one of the essential aspects of. And you see, this is an important thing to talk about in the course. Is what is the nature of the priesthood?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
and part of the nature of the priesthood is that the priesthood the priest recapitulates the parish before God, and so by the priest saying the prayers doesn't mean that he's simply praying for the congregation. He's praying with the congregation, and the congregation should be praying with him. But he recapitulates the whole before God, and then of course then distributes the gifts. But it's an interesting experience, you know, in the liturgy to you know, to say the prayers. For me, I can't go to liturgy without saying the prayers, doing the prayers. I mean, the priest prayers. I know most of them now by heart after 39 years as Orthodox.
They are the most beautiful of the liturgy, actually.
Well,
Starting from the dressing, like the dressing of the priest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they are like profound,
Yeah.
especially in spiritual warfare.
Right?
They teach us to say those prayers. It's really putting the garment, you know, the armor of God. Then
Right.
it's the most beautiful prayers.
Yeah, they're not just beautiful, but they are the substance of the liturgy.
Exactly.
And it's, you know, the litanies are there, but it's the prayers that are the substance, and the prayers are what provide the movement. And you know, and when we go through the liturgy, we'll go through the prayers in great detail, so that you can kind of get the feel of it.
So why is it again, Vladika, I'm sorry, I probably lost the link in there. Why is it that in certain traditions it became silent? Those prayers became
In almost
silent?
the entire Orthodox world, it became silent.
Why?
Why? I think it was practical that you had these huge cathedrals and these little old, you know, frail old bishops, and they couldn't say the prayers aloud. They couldn't project. And so instead of having everything just go dead, while you had the bishop kind of with his vested powers on master and others, you know, the choir would sing over the top of it, or they'd do the litany over the top, you know, because it would probably be all that poor bishop could do and the priests to do the ekphonesis, you know, which is "For thine is the kingdom," or whatever "For thou art a good God," or you know, whatever. That's called an ekphonesis.
I have a question.
Sure.
So some of the parts of the liturgy that aren't as, I guess you could say, like relevant today, or at least we don't practice them, like the doors and catechumens depart and things like that, that don't, were they put in there because of like that time and what they were doing? Why are they still in the liturgy? What is the function of having all those things?
Well, they're remnants of the past, and in some places they're still used. There are some places that still kick the catechumens out.
Elder from monasteries actually kicked out.
Yep.
If you're not an Orthodox.
Yeah, and then they shut the doors. So Mount Athos, they do that, and there are some parishes that do that too. Then, as I said, then it gives the liturgical bouncers something to do. You know.
What? Why do you think that changed for most Orthodox churches, that they don't kick the catechumens out?
Because there were no catechumens for so long.
Mm.
Because everybody was baptized as an infant.
Hmm.
And so few and far between were the adult converts.
Mm.
Because what we were dealing with from probably the 7th century on, it took several hundred years for the Roman Empire to convert, but it did eventually. And so probably from the 7th century on, there were very few adult catechumens. Whereas before that, it was the rule.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very complex liturgical entrance into the church was a very complex liturgical act. And you think about it, you kick out the catechumens, what do? Well, in the places they now kick them out, they go in and they make the coffee, which is not a bad idea. But historically, what happened is that there was a catechetical class that they would go to. Of course, so they would be there for the first part of the liturgy. They would hear the gospel, they would hear the sermon, and then out, and the doors would be shut. It doesn't work to shut the doors anymore because you've got half the congregation coming in in some places after the Lord's Prayer. Pop in for communion, which is really bad practice. I love the story about the bishop who was in Hong Kong, and he got so tired of people showing up late for church. After the small entrance, he had the door shut and locked. And there were people bang, and it was Palm Sunday, which is like, Palm Sunday is actually as big, or in some cultures it's bigger than Pascha. So people were too happy. So that's a kind of it with the catechumens. There weren't any, and so in many places they dropped the catechumens litany altogether. In some places they still drop the dismissal, which, if you're used to it, it makes it kind of the flow is a little odd, but then the other thing is the doors. And so the catechumens have been ousted. You've had the great entrance, and the first litany after the entrance, with the deposition of the gifts on the altar, and then the bishop gives the peace, and then the deacon says the doors. Well. In some traditions, the doors and the curtain are shut after the great entrance, and so at the doors, the curtain is opened. Now, when there's a bishop serving, the doors remain open. The royal doors remain open. But when there's a priest serving alone, this parish, because of its status, has a special blessing to keep the doors open. But in normal situation, the royal doors would actually be shut for that entire time and would not reopen until communion. Some places do that, some places don't, but that's the proper practice. In Greek monasteries, they shut the doors and the curtain after the great entrance, and even the curtain is not reopened until communion. And so there are different practices, and it's important to remember that it's not a matter of right and wrong. It's just that they're different, and different places have different kind of configurations of practices. and different combinations. And so,
Is that up to the priest?
no, it's usually up to the tradition of the church. So if you have a Russian church, Russian tradition church, then you'll serve it in the Russian way, and which has a certain set of rubrics. And if it's a Serbian church, it'll do it in another way. If it's a Greek church, it'll do it another way.
But it's always emphasized the separation between the priest and the parishioner. Like we are different?
It's a
Or kind of a hierarchy. I mean,
well, I think one of the things is and especially that got introduced into the whole conversation by the Roman Catholics in the past 40 years is the idea that the priest has power. It's a power position, and has nothing to do with that. The priest has a particular role. The priest's role or the bishop's role is to be the sacramental presence of Christ in the midst of the community, and that goes all the way back to the first century. It's really, we'll read through some of the ancient fathers like Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who talks about that, and there's also in the way that the ritual, especially the shutting of the doors and the curtain at various times, was put together, was also at a time when there was a change, and it actually hit about the same time as the prayers started being done silently. Up until that time, when you had writers writing about the liturgy, it was what they wrote about was directly connected with what was happening in the prayers themselves, and what was directly liturgically happening at that point. Later on, starting about the 8th century, 9th century, you had this overlay of a mystery play, of the Eucharist as a mystery play. And this also was about the same time as people started going to communion on an infrequent basis. Because for many centuries, probably about the 6th, 7th century, all the way up until now in certain places, people would go to communion once a year, or just a few times a year. Now, personally, I think that's really, really, really bad practice. And one of the great things St. Basil said, which is very useful, there's nothing worse than a bad old custom. Because it has all this antiquity, and this has hundreds of years of antiquity, of authority. That you should only go to communion once a year. You fast very, very severely for a week, and you go to confession right before you go to communion, and you say all these prayers, and you do all these prostrations, and you do all this stuff to get ready for communion. And then you go to communion on that day, and then you ignore the feast and the fast the rest of the year. Ignore Great Lent, ignore, Wednesdays and Fridays, just you do your communion, and that's a mess. And that's not that's not how the church structured its life. One of the things that's really important to remember is that the liturgy is situated within a whole complex of services, which give structure to the day, to the week, to the month, to the whole year, to the seasons. And if you live life liturgically according to the calendar, your life is going to be governed by, what's the day of the week? Is it a fast day? Is it a feast day? Who's the saint of the day? Was there just a great feast, or are you preparing for a feast? Or are we in a fast in preparation for a feast, or are we in the after feast of a feast, or all of these things, and you adjust your life accordingly, so that you are able to go to the services morning and evening, and midday maybe, and go to liturgy frequently, and this is the life of the early church. This is how people lived in the early church. Their entire lives were structured by the church. You lived in an Orthodox village. You went to church in the morning for matins, maybe for liturgy, for vespers in the evening as you were coming home from the field, and you'd probably do compline at home with your family. And if you were in Russia, you would do 500 prostrations together.
Oh.
But you have communion once a year. Whose fault is that? The priests?
No.
Or the obscurantism of the whole system?
No, it's not. It's not. It wasn't the priests. It was. I'm sure that some of the priests had something to do with it, but it was. There was a sense of unworthiness among the laity that they would, because they didn't want to. They didn't want to prepare for communion, even when they were, living, just living a regular Orthodox life and going to church, only once or twice a day, and they kind of wanted to do what they wanted to do. They didn't want to pay attention to all these rules for going to communion, and so they quit going to communion very often. But then the worst thing that happened was that you had to present to the government a document that you had been to confession and communion that year if you wanted to have a job.
Wow.
Yeah, especially with the civil service. And this was especially true in Russia, but I would bet it was also true in Byzantium as well. So people would structure their lives so that during Lent sometime, when they were supposed to be fasting, they would pick a week during Lent, and usually not Holy Week. They would do the fasting and the prayers, and they would go to communion on that Saturday probably, and not go to communion the rest of the year.
And it was confessions must have been very long.
Right.
A whole year.
Right. So that whole thing turned into a mess, and but hey, right now there are still parishes in this country in Rokor, in the Greek Archdiocese, in the Serbian diocese, and probably even a few in the OCA. I don't know about the Antiochians, or some of the traditional Bulgarians. Once a year, that's it. So, bad old practices.
Vladika, how about the Holy Fathers, like the Holy Fathers of the Desert, and they actually didn't have liturgy. And there are some monks, like for instance at Mount Athos, that they do not commune, or they don't practice like the liturgy.
Well, that's a complex question. In relation to monasticism, you have three major styles. One is the Cenobian, which is the big community monastery, where the liturgy of the church, not just the Eucharistic liturgy, but the daily cycle of services, structures the entire life of the monastery. And when you think about going to a monastery, and that's what people are thinking of, they're living life liturgically. And it's pretty neat, actually. It's really a remarkable thing. Then there's a skete, which is usually a spiritual father with his disciples. And they may or may not do the entire liturgical cycle. Now, the entire liturgical cycle is set up for 8 to 10 hours a day. To last 8 to 10 hours a day. Okay? Unless you have a big crew, you can't pull that off. It's just too much. And so smaller communities will be selected. They'll still do morning and evening. But they may only do liturgy 4 days a week, whereas the great monasteries will do liturgy every day. Then you have the hermits, who have been given a blessing. Now the hermits almost always live in proximity to a monastery, where they can go to the monastery on weekends to receive communion or participate in the liturgy. In the Orthodox world, there are also communities of hermits, the cells, like on Mount Athos, where you have groups of hermits, like the Skeet of St. Anne, I believe, where you have groups of hermits who have their little huts around, maybe 100 yards, maybe a mile from a church, the central church of the Skeet, and that church will have liturgy on they'll have the vigil on weekends, and they'll have the on Saturday night and with liturgy in the morning, and some places they'll even have liturgy every day or whatever. But the monks live in their kelia, in their cells, and they don't take with them the 18 or 20 liturgical books in order to be able to pull off the Orthodox liturgical cycle. You can't do that. I mean, it's overwhelming, and you can't do it alone. I mean, feasibly. And so they say the Jesus prayer, and their life is. Their spiritual life is the Jesus prayer, and their preparation is the Jesus prayer, and so when they go to church, they, it's after, after an entire week being immersed in the Jesus prayer, and can you imagine being better prepared for communion than that?
And the Holy Mothers of the Desert too, like Saint Mary of Egypt, right?
Yeah,
40 years.
Yeah, well, she's a total radical exception. You can't. She's in no way, shape, or form a model for or a norm for how. In the first place, there's only probably 2 or 3 people in the entirety of history who've done anything like that. That's why she's held up as this. As the ultimate ascetic. But there was no difference between men and women in this. In the monastic life. For women's monasteries, they'd have of course a male priest. There's only male priests would come in and serve the services, but otherwise, there's no difference in women's form of monastic life than in men's. And they have hermitesses and all of that. So,
is it generally good to receive the Eucharist as frequently as possible, and can you receive it too much? And how would you go about determining what is too much? Or
well, your spiritual father determines that with you.
Okay.
And so, no, it's a very good thing to receive it very frequently. There's a book that came out at the end of the 18th century by Saint Macarius of Corinth, who was one of the Colivades fathers. They were called Colivades because they ate coliva at certain times that other people didn't. But they were the great spiritual fathers who collected and published the Philokalia and revived monasticism. Monasticism in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, monasticism had gone 16th, 17th, 18th century had gone through a very low point. Byzantium was conquered in 1452 it fell. And 53. And it continued for a while, but the massive persecution of the monastics began, and 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, 18th century, it became very formal and external, and very few people went into the monasteries. The Russian church, same thing. The Russian church came out of the Mongol domination not too long before Constantinople fell, and so it began to rebuild. But at the end of the 16th, end of the 16th century, there was the kind of victory of Joseph Volotsky and over Neil Sorsky, and it just went into this very external, formal thing where the monasteries owned massive estates and managed and owned thousands of serfs and things like that. So different situation, but with the same effect. Low level of spiritual life. And there's actually very few saints from those centuries. There's a few, but very, very few. And then St. Macarius of Corinth and those who were with him put the Philokalia together. There was a Ukrainian monk, Paisy Velichkovsky, who took the texts and translated them into Slavonic and into Romanian, and he and his disciples not only was their monastic life transformed by it, but they also spread those texts and the monastic form of life that was the life of the Holy Fathers that you find in the Philokalia into Russia, and that began a whole renaissance of monasticism, not only on the Holy Mountain, but also in Russia, and also in Romania.
Is a required reading, right, for the monastics?
What's that?
A required reading?
No. Philokalia is a handbook for spiritual fathers. Not everybody should read it.
In Romania, they were telling me that they make it mandatory at the monasteries.
It depends on the person and depends on what they can deal with.
Yeah. And one of the nuns was, oh my gosh, how am I going to go to 20 books?
Anyway, that was a long rabbit trail. St. Macarius of Corinth wrote this book on the constant communion of the Holy Mysteries. And so basically, one of the things that they restored is frequent communion of the Holy Mysteries. Now, in many monasteries, especially on the Holy Mountain, a lot of places they have the practice that the day before you receive communion is a fast day. But some odd practices arose, and you still have some of those like in Elder Ephraim's monasteries, and in some of the other Athonite monasteries, of Saturday being a fast day. Now the canons forbid fasting on Saturday. So you have this conflict, because the basic structure of the week is that you fast on Wednesday and Friday, and with the idea that you can receive communion all week. St. Basil's rule from the 4th century was to receive communion on Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, or Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday, and to celebrate the liturgy on those days. So that's what we did in our monastery, and there's a lot of monasteries that do that, that follow that cycle. When we were starting out, I had a superior who told me that I should be serving the liturgy every day. Well, the monastery consisted of me and a bunch of hippies, 20-somethings for the most part. And, so we did the best we could. So for 2 years, I served the liturgy almost every day, straight. And being in the OCA, everybody would go to communion every day. They would also go to confession every day too, which is that, but that's a normal monastic practice. The more frequent the communion, the more issues came up. Because what happens is the grace that you receive from Holy Communion, it accelerates the process of purification. And if you've had a rough life and you have a lot of issues, it's all going to come vomiting out. And so it became very difficult for them, and it became very difficult for me to have to, trying to deal with their emotional and spiritual turmoil. And so we kind of turned down the volume, as it were, by going to Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday for liturgy, which is my hope, would get a new monastery going, to go back to that. But not yet. So that's the reasoning about receiving communion, or the history of receiving communion on a frequent basis. But basically, ask your spiritual father what he thinks is best, and what kind of preparation. In Rokor there is a kind of standard, or in the Russian Church in general, there's a standard of preparation for Holy Communion, and if you're keeping the fasts according to the Church's prescription, the Wednesdays and Fridays and and the fasting periods and stuff, then you should be able to go to communion every day. But there are prayers of preparation before communion, which consist of 3 canons and the Cathist. Now that happens to be the monastic daily rule for most in Russian monasteries. That's the kind of that everybody has to do, the 3 canons and the Cathist. So somehow that got transferred over to lay people for doing as the rule of preparation for communion, plus the prayers of preparation for communion, including the canon before communion and the 10 prayers. And there are some places that they really enforce that, actually. And the priest won't give you communion if you haven't done that, unless you're old and sick or something like that. But that's the Russian style. Other traditions have other, but I'm not sure what they are.
And communion for people who have certain illness, certain disease, such as Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
There are some traditions, like I remember Nasha Adriana wanted to take communion, and they wouldn't give it to her because they were afraid that she would have an episode of Alzheimer's and spit it out or do something like this.
Well, they should give it to her.
Yeah.
Even if only they gave the blood,
Yeah.
But not, the basic rule is you should give people communion, especially if they're sick.
Mm-hmm.
And you just figure out what's the best way to do it. You can't give communion to somebody who has died.
Mm-hmm. But that was inside of a monastery. They would not give it to me.
Look, one of the things that's really important to remember is that monasteries, like lay people, have all sorts of bad old customs, and there's a lot of, and one of the things that Orthodoxy, being a very, reflecting a very traditional religious society, right? There's elements that have survived that are like superstition and the old religion, and and you need to be critical, and you need to, and a lot of these customs, you go between, you could have 2 monasteries or 2 parishes where the things that the priest tells you are absolutely mutually exclusive. And you just follow the discipline of the one that you go to. Then you'll get mad at him and go to the other one. That's typical Orthodox, right?
But that is incorrect.
It's not good, it's not correct, but it's typical.
And there is a story in that The Life of Everyday Saints is the opening vignette, actually, of a real case story of a woman who asked for a blessing of her spiritual father to go to a surgery. He said no, didn't make sense to her, and a nun said, "Oh, don't worry, I have this other priest to go talk to him, he's going to give you a blessing." And she actually died in the surgery.
Mm-hmm.
A very simple eye surgery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's a good lesson about you don't play one off the other.
Exactly, exactly.
Just don't ask anyone.
Yeah. If I can't get it out of Dad, I'll get it out of Mom. Very old habits. Yeah. So what else?
Antika, what is the difference between a bed and a biednica? I see these terms in pre-revolutionary Russian diaries, including priests. And I wondered, one seems to be shorter than the other. It's liturgy, but shorter. Why do they call it that?
A biednica?
A biednica. And
Well,
a bied.
there's a bied. A bied is lunch.
Yeah, or a promise.
Yeah, but a biednica is the typica. And what typica is.
And that doesn't include communion.
No, not normally.
Uh-huh.
Typica is often added after the 6th hour when a church is not going to celebrate the liturgy.
Ah.
So it's got a lot of the kind of basic parts of liturgy, except for the prayers of the liturgy and the consecration and communion. So it's got the 3 antiphons. It's got the Trisagion. It's got reading. It can have the readings in it. You got the Triparia for the day. You got the Creed. You got the Our Father. There's an absolution. So, but all in 15 minutes or 10 minutes.
And the fascinating procurement element. I know we're gonna talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, not in Typica Jonah.
Nope.
No. So.
And there are certain expressions that are used throughout the service. I actually tried counting them because there are so many. During the service, what is the most used sentence? Throughout the service.
Let us pray to the Lord.
Oh Lord, have mercy.
Lord have mercy.
Lord have mercy. I could try count. So my goodness, that's a lot of Lord have mercy. And yet, this expression appeared just once or twice in the Bible. It's
Right.
so interesting. Yeah, so sort of
Well,
understand.
it appears a lot more than that.
Yeah, well, in the way that is said, like Lord have mercy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so it's really knowing how the services evolved to be at the structure that it is now. That to me would be an interesting component.
Mm-hmm.
How did it evolve from Christ, being with his disciples, celebrating the Passover ceremony that became the precursor to all of these different, the hours, the reading of the hours, the preparation, and then the structure of the service as is today.
Actually, you bring up, I think, what I would challenge as one of the great commonly held fallacies that that the liturgy evolved from the Last
From the
Supper.
Uh-huh.
How did it evolve?
It came out of the temple sacrifices.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's right. It makes sense.
Yeah.
Because those were the types.
Yeah,
Yep.
and actually, if in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper was a Passover meal. In John, it was not. We followed the Johannine chronology and not the what do you call it, the synoptics. Yeah.
What? Oh, sorry. Why would you say Orthodox almost? I mean, I don't know how many liturgies are typically used, but it seems like there's like 2 or 3 that are largely used, and not that many more. Why those? Are they just better than all the other ones?
Well, the church basically decided that these are the ones that are the most adequate. For the first several hundred years, there were hundreds of liturgies. You know, and there are like 5 or 6 major traditions of the liturgy, which reflected the liturgy of the capital city. There was the Antiochian style, there was the Cappadocian style, which actually got transferred to early Constantinople. There was the Roman style, the Latin, there was the Syriac, East Syrian style from Edessa and Baghdad, and then there was the Egyptian style, and then the Ethiopians developed. They were so isolated from the rest of the Christian world that they totally developed their own. There's common elements, though. You know, the basic structure is always the same, and then there are certain sequences that are the same. Lift up your hearts, and we lift them up unto the Lord. Let us give thanks to God. The Sursum Corda, as it's called in Latin, is common to all the liturgies, the apostolic liturgies. But the texts all differed, and initially the bishops would, because the bishop was the celebrant of the liturgy for each community, the bishop would. Well, he would use a tradition, but he may or may not use his own words. But what was the tradition in the first couple hundred years of the church was to not write it down, because the first thing that during the persecutions that the police would go after were the books, and they didn't want. And we still say today, I will not speak of thy mysteries to thine enemies. They didn't want any of that exposed. So there were certain traditions that were orally passed on, but never written down until the 4th century, 400 years later, 300 years later. And St. Basil discusses that in his book on the Holy Spirit.
So what was the very first liturgical service? Was it in Greek? Was it I read somewhere there was the Coptics that had the very first official sort of structure liturgical?
No, undoubtedly it was in Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem?
Look, the book of Revelation, chapter 4, is a picture of the Christian liturgy. Okay? You had 24 priests standing around a cubical throne or altar table, and in white vestments with golden crowns, making prostrations and singing "Holy, Holy, Holy." That sounds kind of familiar, right? Okay. One of the people tend to think the early church was like a Baptist Bible study, or everybody would sit around, or like a 1970s Catholic Mass. You kind of stand around in the table, or sit in a meadow someplace, and and the priest would say say in the anaphora and say the words of institution, and and then he'd pass around the basket with the bread, and hey dude, you know, here, take some of the. I went to a lot of liturgies like that. But that's not how the liturgy. If you understand that the book of the Revelation is a snapshot of what the early church, the liturgy of the early church looked like, it was pretty developed. And it developed directly out of the temple liturgy. And the priesthood came, you know, John was probably a priest, a Jewish priest. James supposedly was a high priest. So was John, actually, in the Jewish temple. And so it wasn't, you know, the early services of the church, and the liturgy is what the community would do when they got together, where they would break bread together. They didn't write it down. They kept it secret because that was, you know, the esoteric tradition was very important. But there was definitely an apostolic tradition of liturgy. Now, we don't know when it crystallized, but I'm sure it was crystallized by the time of St. Paul. You know, maybe in the 30s, you know, a few years after Jesus' resurrection, it probably wasn't quite. But by the year 45, I would imagine things were quite formal, and by the end of the first century, you had a very, very highly developed liturgical structure.
And with St. Peter too, right?
Oh, all the apostles, yeah, because the apostles were the high priests of the church. That's what a bishop is. A hierarch means a high priest. So it was the priests and the presbyters at the time were just they didn't serve liturgically. They were the parish council. They were the elders of the community. That's what presbyter means. It means elder, and they didn't have a liturgical role. The service was done by the bishop and the deacon with the congregation. You know.
And what happens with the orthodoxy of Latika? Like, I know that in Romania, to this date, there is a part of them that receives funding from the state. So there is a connection in there. I don't know if it is like this in Russia too.
No, the church is in Russia. The church is completely independent.
Independent.
Like it is here.
So do you know if in cases like this you still have some obligations towards the state, or how do they?
Well, all of that, you know, there's a long history of that. You know, during the Byzantine period, the church was essentially a department of state. And in the Russian Empire, the church was a department of state. And so, in the Russian Empire, the priests, they ranked the priests in direct correspondence to the military rankings. And so there were 18 ranks in the military, and what is it, G1, G2, G3? And there were 18 ranks in the priesthood. You know, from patriarch, metropolitan, archbishop, bishop, you know, mitred archpriest, like Father Victor, double-crossed mitred archpriest, you know, on down, you know, archpriest, and, you know, priest with, you know, with the shield, and priest with the you know,
the purple bonnet,
with the purple hat, and, you know, all this stuff. And each one was a pay grade. Well, that went with the 19th century. don't tell the Russians that, you know. But in the church now, and especially the Russians in America, you know, they think the Tsar still supports the church, which is horrible. But there were always people who would make donations to the church. And part of the important thing about that is that the church was the primary welfare agency in the society. And that's something that we've fallen horrifically short on in America.
Yeah, because in places like this, there are orphanages, like the ones that are...
Orphanages, hospitals, hospices, homes for widows, home for the poor, you know, food pantries, you name it, all of that stuff. In fact, the early monasteries were primarily the staff of these institutions. That's how a lot of the early monasteries developed, and so they were urban, and they were active life, as opposed to contemplative out in the middle of the wilderness. So.
And you also mentioned last week that you were going to order some books.
Yeah, I haven't done that yet.
Okay, so we get it from you.
Right. I think it'd be easier that way. And I was looking today. I couldn't find it. What I was after. So, how much? 15, 20 is 15, 20 bucks too much?
No.
Okay. So, I'll see what I can do to get a bunch of liturgy books, because it's good to have. Very good to have. It'll be the OCA translation, because Roker doesn't put one out with all the prayers and everything. So what else?
The hours and the vigil.
Uh-huh.
About this. I mean, this can't be answered in a sentence, or maybe it's some class session on just the vigil and dissecting of what it is, how it's structured, and it's very complicated.
It's very complicated. But what it is, it's the prayers of the daily cycle. It's matins and vespers and matins put together, and the hours are also the daily cycle. You know, the prayers with the idea that you do the prayers at the various hours of the day to sanctify those times of the day. So matins at before sunrise, because it culminates in glory to thee who has shown us the light with the sunrise and the great doxology. Then after that first hour, it's at 7 o'clock. Third hour at 9 o'clock. Sixth hour at noon. Ninth hour at 3, followed by vespers for a while, and then followed by compline. And then at 3 a.m. the midnight office. So all around the clock. But in modern usage, especially secular parochial usage, it's all smashed together. You know, so we have the all-night vigil being 2 hours on Saturday night. It's supposed to go all night. You go to Mount Athos, in some place it is.
The Coptic church does that too. They have all-night services, and they have like the little booklet. They actually read the hours during the hours.
Oh yeah.
And there is a correlation too, right, Vladika, with like the time that Jesus was crucified, the time that he died on the cross.
Well, that's all specified in the hours. But those specific commemorations are only read during Lent, actually. So, in the hours. But the hours, normally the liturgy is celebrated in the morning, It's celebrated after the 6th hour is read. It's very often they just keep reading. They start with the midnight office and matins and keep going 1st, 3rd, 6th hour, and then you're into liturgy. And it's nowhere near the 6th hour, which is noon. So,
what would be the bare minimum stuff that you would need to celebrate a liturgy? Like what items do you need? No, I mean, like you need a priest and like what's the if you want to start a church in your basement, like how do you put together a basic liturgy kit?
I have a church in my dining room.
Oh yeah.
As a matter of fact. Basically you need a priest and you need somebody to say amen. And it really helps if you have a reader or singer. Mm-hmm. Otherwise you have Sam helping you. There's a Russian saying, Sam chitаю, Sam payu, Sam kadila podаю, which means I read it myself, I sing it myself, and I get myself the censor. Sam. Sam means myself. Yeah. So you need a priest, you need at least somebody else to say amen. And so far as the stuff goes, and I'm really good at this because I was a mission priest for many years, and I had a church in a box that I would tote all over the place. So you need obviously a table, an antimens, which is who has the relics in it and has the signature of the bishop authorizing the service of the liturgy. The chalice and the discos with the star and the covers and the spear and the spoon. You need obviously prosphora,
wine and bread,
bread and wine, some water, because the wine is mixed with water. You need an electric teapot. It's good because you put hot water in just before communion. And you need an altar cross.
Okay.
That's kind of the basic, and a censer, and with incense and charcoal, and a little S-curve thing, to hang the censer on. And you can usually find something to hang that.
You need a chalice and a spoon.
Yeah, you need the spoon and the spear.
So why do
and the covers.
I got a question on the spoon. I noticed priests don't use the spoon; they use their hands
For
administering communion for the priests.
Yeah, the priests receive communion in the hand.
Was that the case that all people used to get it like that? Or?
Yeah. And then somewhere in the early Middle Ages, people used to start doing things like taking it home and using it for witchcraft.
Whoa!
Oh yeah, I heard.
And profaning it.
Yeah.
And it used to be that people would take the mysteries home. They would have a special little box and they would take it home and they would commune during the week at home. Kind of like our practice with the prosphora. You take it home and eat some during the week. Well, it used to be actually the Eucharist. But it was abused.
And this thing with the witchcraft, we think that is absurd. Actually, there is a certain country that they are still doing that to it. I'm not going to say like which caste does that, but the priests are very cautious exactly because of that, because they still do that.
Yeah, and those parts of the Carpathians,
Exactly.
They also seal the grave. This grave is sealed until the second coming of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ against vampires.
Yeah, that's the weird thing.
It's in the books.
Well, I think it is
the old religion lives,
Yeah, this is happening now.
Yeah.
With the priest in the box, right? or priesthood in a box.
Church in a box?
Liturgy, yeah, liturgy in a box. That is also the worst case scenario, because like when Father George was in prison, he didn't have any of those artifacts, and they would get just like their ration was a little piece of bread with mold that they would get for the week, if that.
Mm-hmm.
And he would save that, and later on one of the guards that was torturing him, actually, after he saw his cell getting flooded with light, he started bringing him secretly bread so that he commemorated the liturgy daily.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was nothing, no light underground. And he did that daily.
Well, in situations like that, there's all sorts of ways that,
Dispensations. Yeah.
in the Russian Gulag, there were gospel books or pieces of, or parts of a gospel book, certain, like a folio or two, and they would have a little tiny Antamins that you could stick inside the book, and so that you couldn't. It was so small it could hardly be detected, so that it could be hidden. One of the elders that I knew had been in Solovki, in the Gulag, and he had. Long story, but he wasn't even baptized when they sent him there. He had a Bible, and he was turned in by his medical school roommate for having a Bible, and so they sent him to the death camp.
Wow.
Yeah, in the 20s, and so Father Dmitri, and he was catechized and baptized in Solovki, and some of the liturgies there, they didn't have an Antamins, but they were all they knew they were going to die, so they would have an inmate lay down. They would serve liturgy on his chest, living relics.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can
A
you
living martyr.
imagine like serving liturgy in a pitch black place without knowing if it was day or night?
Yeah. I mean, the things that happened in the 20th century are just horrific. I mean, so important to know about, and important to tell young people about, so they don't get, so that they learn that socialism is evil.
Yeah.
Because
And
that's socialism.
Yeah, the most amazing thing to me was when he was about to die at the hospital, he actually, he looked, and I said, "What do you think about it?" And he said, Maria, I really miss the times that I was in prison. I mean, he was about to die, and I'm like, how can you say such a thing, right? Such a place of, that tortured you, and he said, I could not feel as close to God as I did over there, because it was only me and him, nothing else. I had no hope, nothing outside of him. And said, even now I'm about to go, and I don't feel as close to him as I did over there. Yeah.
What do you think about it?
Hazel said something like that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When he was released from prison.
Yes.
Bishop Hazel.
It's really worth reading things like Father Arseny, and some of the other accounts, Father George's work, about what happened in the gulags in the 20th century. So it's about almost 9:30. So I hope this was useful.
Very well.
Okay. So it'll be a little more focused and a little more academic next week. Maybe not academic, but a little more focused. Are you interested in exploring atonement theology, which is, I mean, the underlying theological, or do you want to focus more on the external form for the moment and do the atonement theology later on?
Atonement sounds great to me.
Yeah,
Oh,
just
yeah.
the atonement
Yeah.
theology. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And it all ties in.
So would that be exclusive of the other thing that you suggested later on? Or
Oh no, not
what would be
later
a
on.
better
at all.
way to attack it first? Are we going head first or
Well,
backwards?
you know, because the whole atonement theology, it gets to the root. It gets to the root of what of the historical foundations that the liturgy came out of. Because ultimately, what is the liturgy? It's the restoration of the temple. What does Christianity do? It restores the temple. It restores the type of the heavenly worship. And at the root of that is the whole theology of the atonement, which was the central ritual of First Temple Israelite religion.
Which is gonna happen again during the second coming, right? With our restoring our own.
No, it's already restored. There's one next door.
No, but our bodies, our own bodies are gonna be restored.
Oh yeah, but what I'm talking about is liturgically for us.
Liturgical, yeah.
Yeah, and concretely, you know, the Jewish Second Temple was disregarded as a false temple, and therefore it fell and was destroyed. And the Third Temple that the Jews are wanting to build will be built by the Antichrist and will be the destruction of all of us, of the world. But the true temple that was restored by the Messiah is the Christian church.
Are they preparing the third temple?
What's that?
Are they preparing to build the
Yeah,
third
they are.
temple?
Really?
In Jerusalem?
Oh yeah. They have all the stuff already. They've got all the furniture. Now they just need to get rid
Temple in a
of
box.
They can't do it in a little box.
that. Except I don't think they can restore the Ark. They may have something like the Ark of the Covenant, but they've got all the rest of the stuff. And just look on YouTube. I mean, they go through and they have plans for it. And detailed architectural plans. They have, you know, and they show you the stuff. You know, the vessels and the altars and
They have a location?
yeah, where the Dome of the Rock is.
The Dome of the Rock. That's
Yeah, so it means World War III first,
Yeah.
Armageddon, World War III.
No government has ever allowed Israel to do that. I'm not going to allow it. There's no politician could get elected
No.
on a platform of permitting that, whether they're right, left, or center, or.
No, because it would be
I mean, it would be insanity, and
it would be an apocalyptic war.
yeah.
But that's the
not-
point.
Mm-hmm.
That's the point. Is that when that and that's, you know, thank God that's why it hasn't happened yet.
Right.
And so there's 1/3 of the population being wiped away, but it's getting pretty close with
Yeah,
whatever
it's-
is happening with North Korea.
Yeah, just look at the Book of Revelation.
Yeah.
But not literally. You can't take that one literally. But the point for us is that the Christian church is the messianic restoration of the temple, and the Christian liturgy is the type. It's the sacrament of the liturgy of the kingdom of heaven, as fulfilled in all eternity. It is heaven. So. Okay. It is truly meet to bless the Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God, the Word, true Theotokos, who magnified him. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, into ages of ages.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen.